The lighthouse man. They say the California coast holds its share of strange tales, and I always brushed that off as superstitious talk. But now I've got a story of my own. Something happened out there. Something I still don't quite understand. It was supposed to be a simple trip along the southern coast, a chance to reel in enough to get us through the week. We were a small crew, me, Tom, Hank, and Jim. Hank was a grizzled, salty fisherman with decades on the water, the kind of guy who seemed like he was born knowing how to handle a boat. Tom was the youngest, barely in his 20s, a lean kid with a knack for trouble. Jim was older than the rest of us, quiet and cautious, with a wariness I'd come to rely on. We'd been out since dawn, fishing in the cool morning air. The catch wasn't great, but we were holding out hope for the evening, when the water was usually kinder. Just as we were about to turn the boat around, a sudden unnatural fog rolled in, thick as soup. I'd never seen fog come on like that. 1 minute, the sea was open and clear. The next, it was a wall of white. Hank cut the engine and we drifted, helpless. "We'll need to anchor soon," he muttered, squinting into the fog. "Might be safer to find a place to wait it out." I was about to ask where when he nodded toward a dark shape off to the north, barely visible through the haze. "There," he said. "Island's got an old lighthouse. Fishermen used to wait out fog like this there. I'd heard of it before, Greystone Rock they called it. A sliver of jagged earth in the sea, with the lighthouse as its only landmark. No one knew who had built it or when, but everyone knew the story about the keeper who had vanished there. Some said he'd gone mad. Others that he and his wife had just disappeared without a trace. Fishermen had stopped going there over the years. There was talk of bad luck, strange sightings. But with the fog closing in around us, we didn't have much choice. We made our way to shore slowly, anchoring the boat near a shallow stretch of rocks. I climbed out first, wading through the knee-deep water, the cold biting at me. The island was little more than a stretch of jagged rocks with a thin, winding path leading up to the lighthouse. The place felt strange, wrong somehow, even in the daylight. The lighthouse rose above us, weather-beaten and dark, standing alone on the cliff's edge like a figure frozen in some terrible vigil. There was something grim about it, as if it had witnessed things it could never forget. Tom glanced up at the tower, his face pale. "Isn't this place supposed to be abandoned?" Hank nodded. "Last I heard." But his voice trailed off, and he frowned up at the dark silhouette of the lighthouse. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach twist. There, at the top of the cliff, was a figure. A tall man in an old, black raincoat, standing near the edge, almost as if he'd been waiting for us. His face was hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, but I could feel his gaze, heavy, fixed right on us. He lifted one arm slowly, almost stiffly, and began to wave. Jim took a step back, muttering, "This can't be right. No one's been here in decades." But Tom, curious as ever, seemed drawn to the figure. "I'm going to go check it out," he said, before any of us could stop him. And before we could call him back, he was already climbing up the path, disappearing into the fog. Hank and I exchanged a glance. I could see the worry in his eyes. We called out to Tom, our voices swallowed by the mist, but there was no answer. After a few minutes, Hank cursed under his breath. "Stay here," he ordered, but I wasn't about to let him go alone, and I followed him up the path, Jim close behind me. The fog thickened as we climbed, until it was like walking through a wall of gray. The only sound was the dull crash of waves far below, mingling with the distant howl of wind. We reached the lighthouse, but Tom was nowhere to be seen. Hank called out again, his voice hollow against the stone walls. Only silence replied. Then I saw him, the figure again, standing just a few yards away, his face still obscured by that hat. I couldn't make out his features, only the shadow of a beard and eyes that seemed impossibly dark. He didn't move, just stared at us, as if studying each one of us in turn. I wanted to shout, to demand to know who he was, but something held me back, some deep primal instinct telling me that this man was no ordinary stranger. Slowly, he lifted a hand again and pointed, this time toward the cliff's edge. Hank stepped back, his face pale. "We need to go," he whispered, his voice a shaky murmur. Just then, a sound cut through the fog. A voice, faint, far away, but unmistakably Tom's. I ran toward the cliff, calling out for him, but the sound faded into the crashing of the waves below. "Tom!" I shouted, my voice almost cracking. No response. We turned and stumbled down the path, back toward the boat, our breaths coming fast. The fog seemed to close in tighter around us, heavy and thick, until we finally broke free at the shoreline. We waited there in silence, our eyes fixed on the path, hoping Tom would come running down after us. But he didn't. The minutes dragged on, stretching into hours, until finally, the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. That's when the Coast Guard found us, shivering on the rocks, our faces pale and grim. They searched the island for hours, combing every inch of the cliff. In the end, they found only Tom's hat and a small pocket knife, lying near the cliff's edge. They told us it must have been an accident, that he must have lost his footing in the fog. But as the officers gave their report, Hank and I stayed silent, our eyes drifting back up to the lighthouse. We knew what we'd seen, but no one would have believed us if we'd told them. They wouldn't have believed that there was a man up there that night, waiting, watching, guiding us toward the edge. And in the years since, I've heard the rumors. Sailors and fishermen, passing by on foggy nights, say they've seen a figure standing there in the mist, waving to them from the rocks. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can see him too, just a dark shape against the horizon, standing on the cliff, waiting for the next soul brave or foolish enough to answer his call. Second story, the curse of Lake Michigan. They say Lake Michigan's waves have taken more lives than we could ever count. Growing up in northern Michigan, we heard plenty of stories, but none of us took them seriously. That was until the summer three of us, me, Danny, and Cole, decided to fish a remote corner of the lake, way out past the usual waters. It was Danny's idea. He'd heard rumors about a spot near some rocky outcrops where the fish were supposed to be bigger, practically jumping into your net. Locals warned against it, of course, saying boats had gone missing in that area, people vanishing without a trace. But we laughed it off. Who doesn't love a good ghost story? We set out on a clear, warm afternoon, the sky stretching blue over us and the lake calm as glass. We spent hours trolling along the usual spots, catching the odd perch here and there. Then, just as we reached the point Danny had talked about, our luck changed. The fish were practically swarming. Felt too easy, almost unnatural. Cole, the most superstitious of us, kept looking over his shoulder, muttering that something didn't feel right. But Danny and I ignored him, focusing on hauling in the fish, our excitement mounting with every catch. The sun started dipping low, casting a reddish hue over the lake, and that's when we noticed something odd. Mixed in with the fish were strange things, items we couldn't explain. An old, tarnished pocket watch, barely hanging together, its cracked glass frozen at midnight. A tiny child's shoe worn and frayed. A stuffed bear, its eyes long gone, its fur reeking of mildew. Each time we pulled up our nets, more relics joined the pile. Rusted silverware, tarnished rings, even a broken pair of glasses. All ancient, covered in grime, like they'd been down there for decades. We told ourselves it was debris, maybe from some wrecked ship that had drifted into this part of the lake. But a cold feeling gnawed at my stomach, and from the way Danny's face had paled, I knew he felt it too. The lake grew darker as night fell, the last traces of light bleeding away, and the water seemed to thicken, pressing in around us. We decided to call it a night, figuring we could return the next day with a fresh start. That's when we heard it, the sound of something scratching along the hull of the boat. It was faint at first, almost like branches brushing the wood, but then it grew louder, a steady, insistent scraping that circled the boat. Danny grabbed a flashlight, casting a beam across the lake's surface. For a moment, the water was still, but then something moved just under the surface. We stared, barely breathing, as a pale, white hand seemed to reach up from beneath the water, fingers long and thin, scratching and clawing at the side of the boat. "Get us out of here," I whispered, but Danny was frozen, flashlight fixed on that hand as it sank back into the depths, only to resurface on the other side of the boat. This time, more hands joined it, reaching, dragging against the wood, leaving trails of lakeweed and muck behind. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and suddenly the water wasn't still anymore. It was churning like something was pushing up from below, trying to break free. We scrambled to start the motor, but it wouldn't turn over, just a dull, choking sputter that left us stranded. Cole had started praying under his breath, while Danny stared out, flashlight trembling in his hand. Then we heard something else, a child's laughter, soft and sweet, drifting over the water. It was close, but there was no one in sight, just endless dark water stretching around us. We spent the night huddled together on that boat, too terrified to move, the scratching and laughter haunting us until dawn. We tried to stay awake, but exhaustion overtook us, and I don't remember falling asleep. All I remember is the feeling of cold water on my face, a hand gripping my ankle, pulling me down into the darkness. When I woke up, it was morning, and I was alone on the boat. Danny and Cole were gone. The motor started easily enough, as if it had never been broken, and I drifted to shore in a numb daze. The authorities searched for days, combing every inch of the lake, but there was no sign of them. Our boat was found abandoned on the shore later that week, everything exactly as I'd left it except for one chilling detail. All those old relics, child's shoe, pocket watch, the bear, were stacked in a neat pile in the middle of the boat, like a final message. The official report was accidental drowning, but everyone in town knows better. They say it's the curse of Lake Michigan, that some debts can never be paid, some souls never find peace. And to this day, if you listen closely on a quiet night, you can hear the soft scraping of hands beneath the water, calling for the next ones to join them. Third story, the voice of the marsh. They say there's a spirit in the marsh, and I used to laugh it off as stories old-timers told to keep us from venturing too far out alone. But after what happened to me, I'm not sure those stories were just talk. I've been an oysterman my whole life. It's rough work, but there's nothing quite like the peace of being out there in the swamps of Louisiana with nothing but the low hum of the water lapping against the boat and the call of herons overhead. But since the accident 2 years back, the peace I once knew feels different, haunted. Even. The accident happened late one night. We were out checking traps and I was on a run with my buddy, Aaron. The fog had rolled in thick that evening, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. I took a turn too quickly, and Aaron went overboard. It was so fast, and I thought he'd come right up, but he didn't. He disappeared beneath the dark water, leaving nothing but ripples, and by the time I got to him, it was too late. His face was frozen in shock, as if he couldn't believe what happened, and I'd never forget the way he looked, staring up at me from the water's surface. The guilt stuck to me like barnacles on a hull, no matter how hard I tried to scrub it away. It was my fault, and no matter how much people told me it was an accident, I couldn't shake it. I kept going out, though. I had to work, and besides, the water was the only place I could feel close to him in a strange way. The swamp was where Aaron and I had spent most of our lives. It was about a year after the accident that I started hearing it. Late at night, alone on the water, when everything was dead quiet, a voice would come whispering out of the swamp, like the sound of wind weaving through the reeds. I'd be hauling up nets or cleaning the last of the oysters, and there it'd be, a soft, low voice calling my name. Henry, Henry. At first, I thought I was losing it. It was only at night and only when I was alone. Maybe it was my own guilt creeping back to haunt me. But the voice kept coming, night after night, soft and familiar, tugging at me like a hook caught in my gut. And then it started saying more than just my name. One night, it whispered, "You left me." The words drifted from somewhere in the darkness, somewhere just out of sight, hidden in the tangled brush of the cypress trees. I froze. The water lapped softly against the boat, and the smell of brine and decay filled the air as I held my breath. Couldn't be Aaron's voice, it couldn't. But the way it said those words, it was like someone was standing right behind me, speaking into my ear. The voice kept coming back. "Why'd you let me go, Henry?" And then it'd disappear, swallowed by the marsh, as if it had never been there. After that night, I stopped going out alone if I could help it. But work was work, and sometimes I didn't have a choice. Then came the night when it all changed. It was a calm evening, with a low fog clinging to the surface of the water, like fingers stretched out over the marsh. I was wrapping up, getting ready to head in, when the voice came again, louder than before. "Come to me, Henry." It was clearer, almost pleading, and that's when I noticed the footprints. Deep prints in the mud near the edge of the water, leading from the shallows into the thick reeds beyond. They looked fresh, as if someone had just walked through, and they were too big to be mine. They led away from the boat, back into the marsh. I don't know what came over me, but I climbed out and followed them, each step sinking into the wet earth as I pushed past reeds and branches that seemed to grab at me, pulling me deeper into the swamp. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of damp rot and salt, and the fog seemed to close in, wrapping around me. The footprints wound deeper into the dark, leading to a clearing I'd never seen before, a place where the water was still and black as oil. And then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the water. I squinted, barely able to make it out through the mist, but there it was, tall and thin, staring out over the swamp. Its clothes were ragged, soaked with water, and in the faint moonlight, I could see its face. It was Aaron. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, empty and hollow. His mouth twisted into that same look of shock he'd had the night he drowned. My body went cold, frozen in place as he turned, slow and stiff, to look right at me. And then his mouth moved, but the voice came from everywhere at once, echoing through the swamp. "Come with me, Henry." I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't move. The marsh seemed to come alive around me, water pulling at my boots, reeds swaying with a life of their own. And then everything went dark. When I came to, I was lying on the edge of the marsh, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. My clothes were soaked, and my hands were covered in thick mud. I tried to remember what had happened, but it was like trying to grab smoke. All I could recall was Aaron's face, watching me from the dark, calling my name. They found me there, barely able to speak, mumbling Aaron's name over and over. It took days for the shakes to wear off, and even now, I can barely look at the water without feeling a pull, like something deep in the swamp is waiting for me. I never went back to the marsh after that. Couldn't. Now, people around Winchester say the marsh is haunted. Fishermen avoid it, and every now and then, they claim to hear a voice calling from the water, whispering secrets, calling out names. They don't laugh about the spirits anymore, and neither do I. Fourth story, the call from the depths. I spent my first winter in the Bering Sea working as a greenhorn on a crab fishing boat off the Alaskan coast. Everyone warned me that the work was brutal, and they were right. The sea out there is fierce, the cold unforgiving. But there was something else about those waters, something no one had prepared me for. Our captain was an old hand named Lyle, a man who seemed more at home at sea than on land. He'd sailed these waters for decades and was notorious for keeping us out longer than most would dare. More risk, more catch, he'd say. My fellow deckhands were grizzled veterans who hardly looked at me, the newbie, unless I made a mistake. But they respected the sea, and they respected the strange stories that came with it. About 2 weeks into the season, I first heard mention of the call. We were huddled in the galley, warming our hands and sharing cigarettes, when the topic came up. "Ever heard it, Joey?" One of the deckhands, Pete, asked me, his eyes flicking nervously to the windows. "Heard what?" "The sound from the depths," he said, his voice low. "Some say it's the sea itself calling you. Others say it's something down there, waiting." I laughed it off, but the others didn't. They exchanged looks, the kind that made me wonder if they knew something I didn't. A few nights later, it happened. We were out on the deck, pulling up the final haul before the break of dawn. The air was deathly cold, sharp enough to bite into my lungs with every breath. I was fumbling with the nets when I felt it, a low, deep hum. At first, I thought it was the engine, but this sound was different. It felt alive, vibrating up through the metal of the boat, thrumming through the air and into my bones. It was almost beautiful, but unsettling, too, like a song that was out of tune, haunting and strangely magnetic. I found myself turning, staring out over the side of the boat, down into the black water. "Joey, don't listen to it." Pete's voice snapped me out of the trance. He grabbed my shoulder, his eyes wide with fear. "It'll get you killed, kid. Just ignore it." The others were tense, their faces pale, like they'd heard it too. No one spoke as we finished the haul and returned to the galley, each of us staring into our coffee cups, unwilling to acknowledge the weirdness of what we'd heard. But over the following days, I couldn't shake it. The memory of that hum, the pull it had on me, lingered in the back of my mind. It was like a siren song, one that only grew louder the more I tried to forget it. I kept thinking that maybe it was something valuable down there, something hidden, like a shipwreck waiting to be found. Lyle and the others brushed it off, told me to focus on the job, but the call wouldn't leave me. On the last night before the end of the season, I found myself out on deck alone. The night was colder than any before, with a fog so thick that it swallowed the light from the stars. My breath hung in the air like smoke, and all I could hear was the slap of the waves against the hull and the creak of the boat. Then it started again, the sound. But this time, it was louder, more insistent, a deep, vibrating hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It felt like it was pulling me toward the edge, calling me to look into the depths. My heart pounded as I took a step closer to the railing, the cold air biting into my skin, but the sound was all I could focus on. It was telling me something, I was sure of it, whispering secrets of the deep, the mysteries lying at the bottom of the Bering Sea. I leaned over, staring down into the darkness, feeling the icy mist on my face. I knew it was crazy, but the pull was so strong that nothing else seemed to matter. The last thing I remember is reaching out, as if to touch something in the air before me. The next morning, when the others came on deck, I was gone. They found my boots by a tear in the netting near the side of the boat, the only trace left of me. The sea had taken me just like the stories warned it would. They say the men who heard the sound that night never returned to those waters. The following season, my absence haunted them, the memory of the hum echoing in their minds. And others who have fished those waters since claim they've heard it, too. The low, haunting call from the depths, growing louder every season, like it's searching for something, or someone. Fifth story, the tempest of the past. They say the sea never forgets. 30 years ago, I thought that was just superstition, the kind of thing old-timers grumble over a drink. But after what happened last week, I know better. My name's Jonas Carter. I'm a fisherman, born and raised in a small coastal village in Maine. I've spent most of my life with salt in my veins, breathing the sharp, biting air of the Atlantic. I grew up with the ocean as my backyard, my playground, and, for better or worse, my career. But there's one thing I've avoided like poison: setting out to sea during a storm. It's been that way since the night we lost the Mariner's Hope, 30 years ago. That night took everything from me. Friends, nearly my own life. I was the only one to make it back, and not a day's gone by without the weight of those souls pulling on me like anchors. Yet, life has a funny way of pulling you back to things you'd rather leave behind. Last week, I got into some money trouble. With bills piling up, I was desperate enough to accept a last-minute job. They offered double pay if I'd go out that night, just a quick haul for lobster traps before the storm rolled in. The forecast was bad, real bad. Winds picking up, thick clouds boiling on the horizon, but I convinced myself I could manage, just this once. I told myself I needed the money more than I feared the water. But as I looked out to sea from the dock, I swear, the air felt charged, like the ocean knew I was coming back to it, like it had been waiting. The first couple of hours were uneventful. I was alone on the boat, heading out to the trap lines under a sky that was bruising darker by the minute. I could feel the electricity in the air, a heaviness that settled in my gut. I pulled in the first line without issue, though the wind was picking up, whipping my jacket and stinging my face. I kept my eyes on the job, trying to ignore the building roar of the ocean. Then I saw them, figures on the water, just beyond the reach of my spotlight. At first, I thought they were logs or seaweed, floating along the waves. But then one of them turned, and my heart nearly stopped. I knew that face. Greg, my best friend, the one I'd lost on the Mariner's Hope. He was staring right at me, his face pale, drenched, his hair tangled and matted. But it was his eyes that chilled me. They weren't alive, not anymore. They were glassy, clouded, and fixed on me with a look that was somewhere between sorrow and accusation. I staggered back, gripping the edge of the boat. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I thought I was hallucinating. But then, as the waves rocked the boat, more faces appeared, each of them someone I'd lost that night. Faces half shrouded by water, mouths moving in silent words that were lost to the roar of the ocean. Jonas, one of them whispered, barely audible over the waves. I stumbled back, heart pounding. I tried to shake it off as some twisted trick of the storm, but the faces didn't fade. They drifted closer, until I could see their hands reaching out of the waves, fingers curling as if to grab onto my boat. The sound of the wind shifted, and I could almost swear it was their voices now, calling, accusing, a chorus of names and memories I had tried so hard to forget. Then something hit the boat hard. The hull groaned, and I felt the deck lurch beneath me. It was as if something massive had struck us from below. I clutched the edge of the railing, peering over the side, but there was nothing but darkness, a yawning abyss that seemed to be waiting to swallow me whole. The boat shuddered again, and I was thrown to the floor. My head was spinning, and panic surged through me as I felt the boat being tugged downward, inch by inch, toward the depths. I scrambled back to my feet, but it was like fighting against hands pushing me down, like something or someone was reaching up from below to drag me under. With all the strength I had left, I grabbed the radio, calling out for help, but only static filled the line. Then I heard it, clearer this time. My name whispered from every direction, overlapping voices of friends long dead. Jonas, come down. The boat rocked violently, and I felt water surge over the sides, flooding the deck. My mind went numb as I fought to keep my balance, frantically working the engine, praying to hear the comforting hum of life from the boat. But as I struggled, I saw their faces again, closer now, just beneath the waves, hands reaching, teeth bared in an eerie, silent scream. I thought I could even feel their fingers brushing against my ankles. With a jolt, the engine roared to life, and I sped back toward the shore. The sea fought me every inch of the way, waves crashing over the bow, relentless as if it was trying to pull me back. But I forced myself forward, not daring to look over the sides, afraid of what I might see. When I finally hit the shore, I staggered out, half conscious, dragging myself onto the sand as the locals ran to help. They found me muttering names of those who had been lost in that wreck so long ago. Now, I haven't been back to the water since. I sold the boat, paid off what I could, and I don't dare even glance at the ocean. The storm I faced that night, it didn't just come from the sky. It came from the sea itself, from the past I tried so hard to leave buried. Locals have started calling it Jonas's Storm. They whisper about how I saw the faces of the dead, how I barely escaped their grasp. Some say the sea doesn't let go of those it's claimed, that it waits patient for its debts to be paid. And when the wind picks up and the waves roar against the shore, I know that somewhere out there, they're still waiting for me, calling my name in the storm.